What if the most terrifying ghost story in the Hebrew Bible is not about a spirit rising from the dead, but about a king abandoned by every voice he once trusted? Imagine a moonless night in the hills of ancient Israel. The wind moves across dry fields. In the distance, enemy campfires burn along the slopes of Mount Gilboa like scattered embers waiting for dawn. Somewhere between those fires and the darkness beyond them walks a solitary figure disguised beneath ordinary garments. He is not a servant. He is not a traveler. He is a king. Yet he moves like a fugitive through his own land. The historical record shows that this man is Saul, the first king of Israel, and that he is approaching one of the most forbidden places in his kingdom. But before we ask what happened at Endor, we must confront a deeper question. Why was Saul there at all? The evidence suggests that by this point in his life, every traditional source of guidance had fallen silent. Dreams offered no answer. Prophets offered no answer. Sacred rituals offered no answer. Some scholars argue that the true protagonist of the Endor narrative is not the woman, nor the spirit that appears, but silence itself. Others remain unconvinced, viewing the episode primarily as a warning against forbidden practices. Yet the difficulty with both interpretations is that neither fully explains the atmosphere of desperation that surrounds the story. This raises a deeper question. What does a king do when heaven refuses to speak? As we follow Saul through the darkness, we are not merely entering a tale of necromancy. We are entering one of the most disputed mysteries in ancient theology. Historical fact: a woman at Endor is said to have summoned a figure identified as Samuel. Scholarly interpretation: the nature of that figure remains fiercely debated. Narrative reflection: before we can decide whether Saul summoned the dead, we must first understand the loneliness of a man standing at the edge of defeat, searching for a voice in a world that has gone silent. And it is there, in that silence, that our investigation begins. To understand what happened at Endor, we must first leave the darkness of that night and return to the world that produced it. The historical record places us in the late Iron Age, during one of the most unstable periods in the history of ancient Israel. Across the rugged hills of the Central Highlands, small settlements cling to rocky slopes. Stone houses cluster behind simple defenses. Terraced fields descend toward narrow valleys where grain, olives, and vines struggle against the harsh landscape. To the west lies the coastal plain controlled by the Philistines, a powerful confederation whose military strength increasingly threatens the fragile Israelite kingdom. To the east rise barren ridges descending toward the Jordan Valley. Between these worlds stands Saul's kingdom, caught between expansion and collapse. The evidence suggests that the political crisis facing Saul was not merely military. It was theological. In the ancient Near East, kingship and divine favor were inseparable concepts. Victory in battle was often interpreted as evidence that the gods supported a ruler. Defeat suggested the opposite. This raises a deeper question. What happens when a king begins to believe that heaven itself has turned away? The historical record shows that Saul's relationship with the prophet Samuel had once formed the spiritual foundation of his reign. Samuel was not merely an advisor. He was the intermediary through whom divine guidance entered the political world. Yet Samuel is now dead. His voice has disappeared from the kingdom. Some scholars argue that this loss is the key to understanding the Endor episode. Others remain unconvinced, emphasizing broader political pressures instead. The difficulty with separating the two is that ancient Israelites did not divide political and religious reality into separate categories. The same world that contained armies, harvests, and royal authority also contained prophets, dreams, sacred objects, and divine communication. Archaeological evidence from neighboring cultures reveals widespread practices involving divination, ancestor consultation, and attempts to obtain knowledge from supernatural sources. Yet the Israelite tradition increasingly distinguished itself from these practices, often condemning them. Historical fact: Saul himself had previously expelled mediums and necromancers from the land. Interpretation: the kingdom sought to define legitimate and illegitimate paths to knowledge. Counterargument: the persistence of such practices suggests they remain deeply rooted in popular culture. As we approach Endor, we enter a world where kings feared defeat, prophets shaped history, and the boundary between the living and the dead remained a subject of profound uncertainty. It is within that world, not ours, that the mystery of Saul's final night must be investigated. Imagine an ancient mural illuminated by the trembling light of a single oil lamp. The scene unfolds inside a stone dwelling hidden among the hills of Endor. The walls are rough limestone, stained by smoke from years of burning lamps. Shadows gather in every corner, turning the room into a threshold between certainty and imagination. At the center stands a woman clothed in dark wool garments, her face partially concealed beneath a weathered veil. She is not portrayed as a sorceress from legend, but as a figure suspended between fear and knowledge, someone who has spent a lifetime navigating the invisible boundaries of her culture. Opposite her stands a weary traveler. His royal identity is hidden beneath simple clothing, yet the tension in his posture reveals a burden too heavy to disguise. This is Saul, though the image refuses to emphasize his crown. Instead, it emphasizes his isolation. The most striking element of the composition lies between them. A circle of pale light spreads across the earthen floor, cast by flickering lamps arranged around a shallow pit. Beyond the circle, darkness thickens like a living substance. From that darkness emerges a faint human silhouette, not fully visible, not fully absent. The artist deliberately avoids clarity. The figure appears draped in the long mantle associated with a prophet, yet its features remain obscured. Question: are we looking at Samuel, a vision, a memory, or a symbolic manifestation of judgment? The image does not answer. The evidence suggests that ambiguity itself is the point. Above the figures, smoke rises toward the ceiling, blurring the boundary between earth and shadow. Colors are muted: deep browns, charcoal black, faded crimson, and the pale gold of lamp fire. Every element directs attention toward a single theme: uncertainty. Historical fact: the text describes a woman, a king in disguise, and an apparition identified as Samuel. Scholarly interpretation: the nature of that apparition remains contested. Narrative reflection: the sacred image of Endor is powerful not because it reveals the unseen world, but because it places us in the same position as Saul, staring into darkness, searching for a voice, and unable to know with certainty what is about to emerge from it. The night at Endor stands at the intersection of several conflicts that were already shaping the religious identity of ancient Israel. To understand the controversy surrounding Saul's encounter, we must first recognize that this was not merely a private consultation between a desperate king and a forbidden medium. It was the collision of competing ways of understanding knowledge, authority, and the unseen world. Question: why does the narrative devote so much attention to an act that Israelite law explicitly condemned? The historical record shows that practices associated with necromancy, spirit consultation, and communication with the dead existed throughout the ancient Near East. Archaeological evidence and textual sources from Mesopotamia, Ugarit, and Egypt reveal that many cultures believed the dead could possess knowledge inaccessible to the living. Interpretation: consulting the dead was often viewed as an alternative source of guidance during times of uncertainty. Yet ancient Israel increasingly developed a different model. Divine knowledge was expected to come through prophets, sacred lots, dreams, and authorized forms of revelation. The Endor episode therefore places Saul between two rival systems of access to truth. Some scholars argue that the story was intentionally constructed to demonstrate the failure of necromancy and the superiority of prophetic revelation. Others remain unconvinced, pointing out that the figure appearing at Endor delivers information that proves accurate, complicating any simple condemnation of the event. The difficulty with that interpretation is that the text itself never clearly explains how the apparition should be understood. This raises a deeper question. If the practice is forbidden, why does the narrative appear to grant such power to the encounter? A second conflict emerges within the story itself. Historical fact: Saul had previously expelled mediums and spirit practitioners from the land. Now he seeks one. Interpretation: the king violates his own policy because every legitimate avenue of guidance appears closed. Counterargument: some scholars suggest that the narrative is less concerned with necromancy than with Saul's spiritual decline. Reassessment: both readings may contain elements of truth. The strongest evidence comes from the narrative tension itself. Saul is not portrayed as a curious seeker, but as a ruler trapped between fear and silence. Narrative reflection: Endor becomes a battlefield long before any spirit appears. It is a battlefield between law and desperation, prophecy and forbidden knowledge, divine silence and human need. And because the text refuses to resolve these tensions completely, the debate remains open, inviting every generation to ask the same unsettling question. When legitimate answers disappear, where does a desperate person turn next? The deeper we investigate the account of Endor, the more we discover that the biblical narrative is only one layer of a much larger tradition. Hidden beneath the familiar story are scattered references, later interpretations, and ancient assumptions that often remain invisible to modern readers. Question: how would an ancient audience have understood what happened that night? The historical record shows that the text of 1 Samuel provides remarkably few details about the ritual itself. This silence is significant. The narrator appears less interested in describing magical procedures than in emphasizing the result. Yet surrounding cultures left behind texts describing communication with the dead, and these sources provide valuable context. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia reveals rituals in which deceased ancestors were consulted for guidance, particularly during periods of political uncertainty. Some scholars argue that the audience of 1 Samuel would have been familiar with such practices even if the text deliberately avoids explaining them. Others remain unconvinced, cautioning that parallels do not prove direct influence. The strongest evidence comes from the broader cultural environment of the ancient Near East, where the boundary between the living and the dead was often viewed as permeable under specific ritual conditions. Another hidden detail concerns the figure of Samuel himself. The text states that the woman sees an Elohim rising from the earth before Saul identifies the figure as Samuel based upon her description. Interpretation: some scholars argue that the language preserves traces of an older worldview in which the dead existed within a shadowy underworld known as Sheol. Counterargument: others maintain that the passage should not be pressed into a systematic doctrine of the afterlife because its primary concern is narrative rather than cosmology. This raises a deeper question. Did the author intend to describe what happened in the unseen realm, or merely how the participants perceived it? Later Jewish traditions complicate the matter further. Some interpretations accepted the appearance as genuinely Samuel. Others suggested divine intervention, arguing that the woman herself was surprised by what occurred. The difficulty with every reconstruction is that the text refuses to explain the mechanism behind the event. Historical fact: the apparition delivers a prophecy that is fulfilled. Scholarly interpretation: the identity of the speaker remains debated. Narrative reflection: the hidden texts do not solve the mystery of Endor. Instead, they reveal how many generations struggled with the same question. The more closely we examine the evidence, the less the story resembles a simple ghost narrative and the more it resembles a carefully preserved puzzle whose most important pieces may have been lost long ago. Yet the debate remains open. If we read the Endor narrative only as a report of an unusual event, we risk overlooking the symbolic architecture that gives the story its enduring power. Ancient authors rarely separated history from meaning. Places, actions, and characters often function simultaneously as realities and symbols. Question: what do the central images of the Endor story represent beneath the surface of the narrative? The evidence suggests that the most important symbol is not the apparition itself. It is the journey into darkness. Historical fact: Saul travels by night and disguises himself before approaching the woman of Endor. Interpretation: in ancient literature, night frequently symbolizes uncertainty, hidden knowledge, and separation from ordinary order. Some scholars argue that Saul's movement through darkness reflects his spiritual condition. Others remain unconvinced, noting that practical secrecy alone could explain his actions. The difficulty with that interpretation is that the narrative repeatedly emphasizes darkness in ways that appear deliberately symbolic. A second image emerges from the earth itself. The figure seen by the woman is described as rising upward from below. This raises a deeper question. Why does the text portray the apparition as emerging from the ground rather than descending from heaven? Archaeological and textual evidence from the ancient Near East reveals widespread conceptions of an underworld inhabited by the dead. In Hebrew tradition, this realm was often associated with Sheol, a shadowy domain beneath the earth. Interpretation: the direction of movement reinforces the distinction between prophetic revelation, which comes from above, and communication with the dead, which comes from below. Counterargument. Some scholars caution against imposing a fully developed theology onto a narrative whose primary purpose may be literary. Yet the symbolic contrast remains difficult to ignore. Another powerful symbol is Saul's discarded identity. The king removes the visible signs of kingship and approaches Endor as an anonymous man. Historical fact. The text explicitly notes his disguise. Narrative reflection. The ruler who once stood publicly before a nation now seeks answers in secret. Finally, there is the symbol of silence. Before any apparition appears, before any prophecy is spoken, the narrative repeatedly reminds us that Saul has received no answer through dreams, prophets, or sacred inquiry. The strongest evidence suggests that silence functions as the true antagonist of the story. My reading of the evidence is that Endor is ultimately a drama of descent, a descent into darkness, into uncertainty, into memory, and perhaps into the deepest fear of all, the fear that the universe has stopped answering. Yet the debate remains open, because symbols, like shadows, rarely reveal only one meaning. Among all the interpretations proposed throughout history, none have generated more controversy than those that challenge the traditional assumption that Samuel himself appeared at Endor. Question: what if the narrative is describing something other than a literal return of the prophet from the realm of the dead? The historical record shows that ancient readers did not always agree on the nature of the apparition. Some accepted the account at face value. Others searched for alternative explanations. One of the most debated interpretations views the entire encounter through a psychological lens. The evidence suggests that Saul arrived at Endor in a state of profound fear. His kingdom was collapsing. Samuel was dead. The Philistine army stood nearby. Divine guidance appeared absent. Some scholars argue that extreme emotional distress may provide the key to understanding the event. Interpretation: the figure seen at Endor could represent a visionary experience shaped by grief, memory, and expectation. The difficulty with that interpretation is that the text presents the apparition as an objective participant in the narrative rather than a private hallucination. Others remain unconvinced for precisely that reason. A second and even more controversial theory emerged among certain theological commentators. They argued that the apparition was not Samuel at all, but another spiritual entity permitted to appear in Samuel's likeness. The strongest evidence for this view comes from discomfort with the idea that a forbidden ritual could successfully summon a genuine prophet. Counterargument: the text repeatedly identifies the figure as Samuel and records a prophecy that appears accurate. Critics therefore argue that replacing Samuel with another entity introduces complications not explicitly supported by the narrative itself. This raises a deeper question. Are interpreters attempting to explain the text, or to protect a particular theological assumption? A third interpretation treats the episode primarily as literary theology. Some scholars argue that the author intentionally crafted an encounter in which Saul hears the very judgment he has been avoiding for years. In this reading, the identity of the apparition becomes less important than the message delivered. Reassessment: each theory solves one problem while creating another. Historical fact: the text identifies the figure as Samuel. Scholarly interpretation: the mechanism behind the appearance remains disputed. Narrative reflection: my reading of the evidence is that the forbidden interpretations remain valuable not because they provide definitive answers, but because they expose the tensions hidden within the story itself. Endor continues to fascinate scholars precisely because every explanation encounters a boundary beyond which certainty begins to dissolve. Yet the debate remains open, and perhaps that unresolved tension is part of what the narrative was designed to preserve. At the center of the Endor mystery stand two interpretations that appear almost impossible to reconcile, yet both continue to attract serious scholarly attention. Question: did Saul truly encounter the spirit of Samuel, or was something else taking place beneath the surface of the narrative? The first theory follows the most direct reading of the text. Historical fact: the narrative repeatedly identifies the figure as Samuel. The apparition recognizes Saul, recalls earlier prophecies, and accurately predicts the outcome of the coming battle. The evidence suggests that the author intended readers to understand the figure as the deceased prophet himself. Some scholars argue that the simplest explanation remains the strongest. In their view, The unusual nature of the event is precisely why the story was preserved. They note that even the medium appears startled by what she witnesses, suggesting that something extraordinary occurred beyond her expectations. Interpretation: Samuel truly appeared, not because necromancy possessed legitimate power, but because divine permission allowed a final message of judgment. Yet others remain unconvinced. The difficulty with this interpretation is theological. If Israelite law condemns communication with the dead, why would a forbidden ritual become the setting for a genuine prophetic encounter? This concern leads to the second major theory. Some scholars argue that the narrative should be understood as a theological drama rather than a literal description of supernatural events. In this reading, the apparition functions as a literary vehicle through which Saul confronts the consequences of his choices. The strongest evidence comes from the broader themes of the book, particularly Saul's progressive separation from legitimate sources of revelation. Counterargument: Critics respond that the text presents the encounter with remarkable specificity, making it difficult to reduce the episode to symbolism alone. A third position occupies the space between these extremes. It proposes that the narrative preserves a genuine visionary experience without allowing us to determine its precise nature. The archaeological record cannot fully answer such questions, and the text itself offers no explanation of the mechanism involved. Reassessment: Each theory accounts for certain details while struggling with others. Historical fact remains unchanged. Saul visited Endor. An apparition appeared. A prophecy followed. Scholarly interpretation remains divided regarding what those facts mean. Narrative reflection: Perhaps the enduring power of the story lies in its refusal to collapse into a single explanation. 3,000 years later, we still stand where Saul stood, facing a voice emerging from the darkness and asking the same question. If Samuel did not speak that night, who did? And if Samuel did speak, what does that imply about the boundaries between the living, the dead, and the silence that separates them? When investigating the night at Endor, we eventually reach a boundary familiar to every historian and archaeologist. The text survives. The tradition survives. The debate survives. But what physical traces remain? Question: Can archaeology confirm what happened at Endor? The archaeological record cannot fully answer that question. No excavation has uncovered direct evidence of Saul's meeting with the woman of Endor. No inscription describes the event. No artifact identifies the apparition. Yet the absence of direct evidence does not end the investigation. Instead, it shifts our attention toward the broader world in which the story emerged. The historical record places Endor in the region north of the Jezreel Valley, near the slopes associated with the final campaign against the Philistines. Archaeological surveys in this area reveal Iron Age settlements consistent with the period traditionally associated with Saul. Historical fact: The geographical setting described in the narrative corresponds reasonably well with the known landscape of ancient Israel. The evidence suggests that the authors were writing about a real environment rather than an entirely symbolic one. Beyond geography, archaeology provides echoes of the beliefs surrounding the story. Texts recovered from Mesopotamia contain rituals intended to consult deceased ancestors. Ugaritic literature preserves traditions involving communication with figures associated with the underworld. Egyptian funerary texts describe complex relationships between the living and the dead. Interpretation: These materials demonstrate that necromantic traditions existed throughout the ancient Near East. Counterargument: Similarities do not prove that the Endor ritual functioned in exactly the same manner. The difficulty with direct comparison is that Israelite religion often defined itself by distinguishing its practices from those of neighboring cultures. Another important echo emerges from ancient conceptions of the afterlife. The Hebrew idea of Sheol shares certain characteristics with broader Near Eastern underworld traditions, though significant differences remain. Some scholars argue that the apparition rising from the earth reflects this cultural background. Others remain cautious, noting that the biblical text offers relatively little systematic description of the afterlife. This raises a deeper question. Are we observing a historical ritual, a theological narrative shaped by cultural memory, or both simultaneously? Archaeological evidence can illuminate the world around Endor, but cannot fully reconstruct the event itself. Narrative reflection: Perhaps the most valuable contribution of archaeology is not that it solves the mystery, but that it demonstrates how deeply the story was rooted within a real landscape inhabited by real people who wrestled with questions about death, memory, and unseen realities. The stones remain silent. The manuscripts remain incomplete, yet across valleys, ruins, and ancient texts, faint echoes of the night at Endor continue to survive. To understand the theological significance of Endor, we must temporarily set aside the question of whether Samuel truly appeared and ask a different question. What did this story mean to the people who preserved it? The ancient audience was not primarily concerned with proving supernatural phenomena. They were concerned with understanding the relationship between divine authority, human obedience, and the limits of sacred knowledge. Historical fact: throughout the narrative, Saul repeatedly seeks guidance before the coming battle. The historical record shows that he consults accepted channels of revelation, yet receives no answer. Question: why does the story place such emphasis on divine silence? The evidence suggests that silence itself carries theological meaning. In the worldview of ancient Israel, revelation was not something human beings could command at will. Divine communication remained an act of divine initiative. Interpretation: Saul's tragedy is not merely that he receives no answer, but that he attempts to overcome that silence through his own effort. Some scholars argue that Endor illustrates the danger of seeking certainty outside authorized forms of revelation. Others remain unconvinced, suggesting that the story focuses less on ritual prohibition and more on Saul's personal collapse. The difficulty with separating these themes is that ancient theology rarely distinguished individual character from cosmic order. This raises a deeper question. What happens when a king attempts to obtain knowledge that has not been granted to him? Within the narrative, the world appears structured around boundaries. There is a boundary between prophet and king, a boundary between the living and the dead, a boundary between revelation and human manipulation. The appearance at Endor, whatever its precise nature, occurs at the crossing of those boundaries. Archaeological evidence cannot determine whether such a crossing literally occurred, yet the theological symbolism remains powerful. Another significant element concerns Samuel's message. The apparition offers no new path to salvation, no hidden wisdom, no secret ritual. Instead, it confirms what Saul already fears. Interpretation: the encounter functions less as the discovery of unknown knowledge and more as the confrontation of unavoidable truth. Narrative reflection: from the perspective of the ancient author, the deepest issue may never have been necromancy itself. The story explores the consequences of a ruler who can no longer distinguish between seeking revelation and attempting to control it. My reading of the evidence is that Endor reflects a theological worldview in which knowledge belongs ultimately to the divine realm, while human beings remain limited in their ability to access it. Yet the debate remains open. Whether Samuel appeared or not, the narrative preserves a profound ancient conviction. The greatest mysteries are not always hidden because they are distant, but because they are revealed only under conditions that human power cannot command. As our investigation moves beyond the historical event, beyond the ritual, and even beyond the question of Samuel's identity, we encounter something deeper hidden within the story of Endor. The narrative begins to function not merely as a theological controversy, but as a meditation on the limits of human existence. Question: why has this story survived for so many centuries when countless political conflicts and royal decisions have been forgotten? The evidence suggests that Endor speaks to concerns far older and more universal than the fate of a single king. At its heart lies the problem of knowledge. Historical fact: Saul seeks information about the future. He wishes to know what awaits him beyond the coming battle. Yet the future remains concealed. This raises a deeper question. Why are human beings so drawn toward forbidden knowledge? In the ancient world, uncertainty was not merely an inconvenience. It was an existential condition. Harvests could fail. Armies could invade. Disease could appear without warning. Death could arrive suddenly. Interpretation: the desire to know the future reflects a deeper desire to overcome vulnerability itself. Some scholars argue that Endor reveals the psychological burden created by uncertainty. Others remain unconvinced, emphasizing the narrative's theological concerns. The difficulty with separating these perspectives is that ancient people often understood psychological and theological realities as inseparable dimensions of the same experience. Another philosophical tension emerges around death. The apparition at Endor, whether understood literally, symbolically, or theologically, directs attention toward the boundary that no living person can cross with certainty. Archaeological evidence can reveal tombs. Historical texts can preserve beliefs. Yet the reality beyond death remains inaccessible to direct investigation. The strongest evidence comes not from answers, but from questions. This is why Sheol occupies such a strange place within ancient thought. It represents not a fully described destination, but a realm of mystery, silence, and limitation. Narrative reflection. Perhaps Saul's greatest fear was not death itself. Perhaps it was ignorance. He stands on the threshold of catastrophe, unable to see beyond it. My reading of the evidence is that Endor ultimately explores the tragic condition of finite beings seeking certainty in a world where certainty is rarely granted. The king seeks a voice from beyond the grave because he cannot tolerate the silence surrounding the future. Yet the irony of the story is profound. Even after the voice speaks, the mystery remains. The future is revealed, but its meaning is not. And perhaps that is the deepest philosophical lesson preserved within the narrative. Human beings may obtain fragments of knowledge, but the horizon beyond which complete understanding disappears remains forever before them, receding into darkness as they approach. After following Saul through the darkness of Endor, examining the historical setting, the theological tensions, the archaeological echoes, and the competing interpretations preserved across centuries, we arrive at the point where every serious investigation must confront its limits. Question: what is the deepest conclusion the evidence allows us to reach? Historical fact. A narrative preserved in ancient Israel describes a king seeking forbidden knowledge on the eve of his death. Archaeological evidence. The broader world of the ancient Near East contained traditions of necromancy, ancestor consultation, and communication with the dead. Scholarly interpretation. The identity of the apparition remains one of the most disputed questions in biblical studies. Yet beneath these layers lies a pattern that appears repeatedly throughout the story. The evidence suggests that Endor is not fundamentally about supernatural power. It is about absence. Saul enters the narrative already defeated in a profound sense. The armies of the Philistines are dangerous, but they are not his greatest problem. Samuel is dead. Revelation has ceased. The heavens remain silent. Some scholars argue that the central tragedy is theological. Saul has lost access to divine guidance. Others remain unconvinced, emphasizing political failure, psychological collapse, or literary symbolism. The difficulty with choosing only one explanation is that the narrative itself intertwines them. This raises a deeper question. What happens when every structure that once provided meaning begins to fail at the same moment? The apparition, whatever its precise nature, does not reverse Saul's fate. It does not offer escape. It does not reveal hidden wisdom capable of changing the future. Instead, it confronts him with a truth he already fears. Reassessment. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of the story is not that a voice emerges from the darkness, but that the voice says nothing fundamentally new. Historical fact and narrative reflection converge here. Saul's final journey is not a journey toward secret knowledge, but toward recognition. My reading of the evidence is that Endor survives in cultural memory because it transforms a theological question into a human one. The story asks whether certainty can ever be obtained by force when it has not been freely given. It asks whether knowledge alone can save a person from consequences already set in motion. Most importantly, it asks whether the silence surrounding us is always empty, or whether it sometimes contains truths we are unwilling to hear. Yet the debate remains open. We cannot prove with certainty who stood before Saul that night. The archaeological record cannot fully answer it. The text itself preserves ambiguity, and perhaps that ambiguity is the final revelation. For the mystery of Endor was never designed merely to reveal what emerged from the realm of the dead. It was designed to reveal what emerges from the depths of a human soul when every other source of certainty has disappeared. The night at Endor is over. The lamps have burned low. The woman disappears back into history. The apparition fades into silence. Saul leaves the house and walks toward a future he now believes he understands. Yet as our investigation comes to an end, a strange realization emerges. After centuries of commentary, theological reflection, archaeological research, and scholarly debate, the central mystery remains remarkably intact. Historical fact: Saul visited Endor. A figure identified as Samuel appeared in the narrative. A prophecy was delivered. Soon afterward, Saul died on Mount Gilboa. Archaeological evidence: the world described by the text belongs to a real landscape populated by real kingdoms, real conflicts, and real beliefs concerning the dead. Scholarly interpretation: the identity of the apparition remains unresolved. Narrative reflection: perhaps the endurance of this story depends precisely upon that uncertainty. Throughout this journey, we have examined competing theories. We have weighed textual evidence against cultural context. We have explored ancient concepts of revelation, death, memory, and divine silence. Yet the deeper we traveled into the mystery, the more the question seemed to change. At first we asked whether Saul summoned the dead. Later we asked who appeared before him. Now another question stands before us. Why has this story continued to disturb readers for nearly 3,000 years? The evidence suggests that Endor survives because it confronts a tension that ancient civilizations never fully resolved. Human beings seek certainty. The world often responds with ambiguity. Kings seek answers. Prophets die. Rituals fail. Armies advance. Silence remains. Some scholars argue that the narrative proves the reality of a supernatural encounter. Others remain unconvinced and see a theological drama shaped by literary purpose. Yet the debate remains open because neither interpretation completely dissolves the mystery. My reading of the evidence is that the story's greatest power lies not in the apparition itself, but in the unanswered space surrounding it. If you have followed this investigation from beginning to end, then you have become part of a conversation stretching across generations of scribes, theologians, historians, archaeologists, and seekers of forgotten knowledge. The work remains unfinished. Forgotten scriptures exists within that unfinished space, where difficult questions are not feared, where evidence is examined carefully, and where ancient mysteries are allowed to remain genuinely mysterious. And so we leave Endor with one final question, a question that scholars still debate and that the text itself never fully resolves. When Saul heard a voice emerge from the darkness, was he listening to a prophet returned from the realm of the dead, to a vision shaped by despair, or to a truth that had always been present but could only be heard once every other voice had fallen silent?